Welcome to another deep dive. Today we're tackling modern capitalism. We'll be using Johan Norberg's The Capitalist Manifesto as our guide. We're going to unpack how capitalism actually functions today, got beyond just those typical headlines. And get ready because we're going to find some really surprising success stories. And hopefully we'll get a fresh perspective on some of the common criticisms.
Yeah, and one of the things I think is really interesting about this is that it's easy to get caught up in the purely economic arguments, but capitalism has an impact that goes so far beyond just economics. It shapes our social structures, our values, even our sense of progress.
Yeah, for sure. And speaking of progress, let's start with a fact that might just make you rethink some assumptions. Did you know that over the past 20 years, extreme poverty has plummeted by a staggering 70%?
Yeah.
That's like 138,000 people rising out of poverty every day.
It's incredible. It's a remarkable achievement. And Norberg attributes a big part of this to the spread of free markets and globalization. And he points to some pretty compelling examples like Botswana and Mauritius. These are nations that face some really significant challenges, but they decided to embrace free market principles. And as a result, they've seen some pretty remarkable improvements, both in their economies and in the living standards of their people.
Yeah, that makes sense. But I got to ask, we're just talking about like a few really powerhouse nations that are kind of skewing the data.
That's actually a really common misconception. But the reality is that this poverty reduction, it's global. Tiny nations like Vanuatu, they carry just as much weight in this calculation as giants like China. And what we're seeing is something that economists call convergence. It's a trend that started back in the 1990s, where developing countries actually began growing faster than developed ones. And this is largely fueled by liberalized economies and the really rapid spread of technology.
Oh, yeah, that's interesting. So it's a global trend. But what about, that fear that we always hear?
Okay.
About cheap imports killing Western manufacturing jobs. Isn't that kind of a sign that capitalism is failing us in some way?
Yeah, it's a valid fear. It's understandable that people are concerned about that. But it's important, I think, to kind of look beyond just the headlines. So while it's true that manufacturing jobs in the U.S., for example, did decline, the output actually increased significantly. And the real key factor here is increased productivity. So you have fewer workers needed to produce the same amount, or even more.
Got it. So it's not really about losing manufacturing. It's about doing it more efficiently with fewer people. But doesn't this shift towards automation create other problems then? Like, what about wage stagnation? I've heard a lot about wages not keeping pace with economic growth.
Yeah, and that's a totally valid concern. Norberg offers a pretty thought-provoking analogy to think about this, though. So imagine a hotel where guests are constantly moving to better rooms. If you just took a snapshot at any given time, you might see some empty rooms. But that doesn't really capture the whole picture of the upward mobility. So if you apply that to wages, the idea is that, kind of this static view of inequality, it can be a little misleading. What really matters is that the overall standard of living is rising.
Okay, so hold on. Is that just a theory, or can you give me like a real-world example?
Oh, yeah, totally. Consider this. If you were considered middle class in Sweden back in 1995, you'd actually be considered poor by today's standards.
Really?
Yeah. And so it kind of shows how, prosperity has lifted the floor for everyone. Even if those income disparities, they still persist.
Yeah, that makes sense. So maybe instead of just fixating on that gap between, the richest and the poorest, we should prioritize policies that boost overall economic growth. But how can we be sure that everyone benefits from that growth? It seems like, so many of the products that we use every day are kind of controlled by these massive corporations.
Yeah, well, that's where I think the often overlooked, magic of free markets comes in. So consider something as simple as, a cup of coffee in the morning. There was a journalist named A.J. Jacobs, and he actually tried to thank every single person involved in producing his coffee.
Wow.
So you have the barista, the farmer, the truck driver, the ship captain, even like the engineers who designed the coffee machines.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And he quickly realized that it's this vast interconnected web of voluntary cooperation, and it spans the entire globe.
Yeah, I can see that. But wouldn't this system kind of collapse without strong regulations and some kind of oversight?
Interestingly, Norberg argues that one of the most vital parts of a free market system, and often one of the most misunderstood, is the protection of property rights.
But aren't property rights just kind of a way for wealthy people to hoard resources and maintain their power?
Actually, it's the opposite. Without secure property rights, only those who are already in power can really dictate how resources are used. So imagine, someone in a developing country. They own a small plot of land, but they lack those formal property rights. So they can't really use that land as collateral for a loan. They can't invest in improvements because they don't have legal protection.
So strong property rights can actually level the playing field and empower people,
Exactly.
especially those who might be kind of shut out of the economic system. Makes sense. Okay, but what about the whole drive for profit? Isn't that what leads to exploitation and greed?
Well, Norberg challenges that perception. He emphasizes that profit in a truly free market comes from creating value for others. So think about buying a cup of coffee again. The buyer and the seller, they both benefit from that exchange. They both say thank you because they've both received something that they value.
So it's a win-win, not a zero-sum game. But what about that claim that free markets are inherently unstable and prone to crises?
Yeah. Well, Norberg's argument is that free markets, because they're built on this decentralized knowledge and individual choice, are actually more adaptable and resilient than centralized systems. And he points to a great example, which is during the COVID-19 pandemic. So the EU's trade restrictions actually made shortages worse. But then imports from outside the EU, which were driven by, free market forces, helped to fill those gaps and stabilize supply chains.
So in that case, more control actually led to less stability. It's interesting. So then policies that are aimed at bringing jobs back, enacting tariffs, those might actually backfire.
Yeah, Norberg explores that very issue. He brings up Bastiat's concept of, what is seen and what is not seen.
No, yeah.
So while tariffs might save a few jobs in a specific industry, the unseen costs are often much greater.
Yeah, like higher prices for consumers and reduced competition.
Right. Exactly. It seems like there's always more to the story than just what we see on the surface.
Definitely. Okay, well, I'm starting to see how complex all of this is. But, I can't help but think about that statistic, that the world's billionaires own more wealth than the poorest 4.6 billion people combined. I mean, that just feels wrong.
It's a pretty shocking statistic. But Norberg encourages us to consider the nuances. So this disparity, it's partly due to how we measure wealth. The poorest often lack financial assets. And Oxfam, the organization that popularized that statistic, included indebted Westerners in their calculation of the world's poorest.
So maybe focusing just solely on that gap between rich and poor isn't really the most helpful way to approach this.
Right.
So what's the alternative then?
Well, Norberg argues that instead of fixating on inequality, our focus should really be on lifting people out of poverty. And he cites the work of Nobel laureate Angus Deaton, who suggests that it's low incomes, not inequality itself, that we should be most concerned about.
That makes a lot of sense. But how do we address those low incomes without resorting to, heavy-handed government intervention?
Well, it's about making a distinction between free markets and what's known as crony capitalism. Basically, it's a system where businesses use their political influence to gain an unfair advantage, often through regulations or subsidies that end up stifling competition. Norberg uses a really interesting example of the Fangel brothers' sugar empire in Florida. So they've benefited from government subsidies for years, and they've used that money to basically solidify their position and limit competition. And that ends up hurting consumers and taxpayers.
Wow. So crony capitalism creates an environment where success isn't really based on merit or innovation, but more on who you know in government. That doesn't sound good. Sounds like a recipe for stagnation. Okay, but what about the tech giants? Aren't they like the new monopolies? Aren't they stifling competition and innovation?
Well, Norberg acknowledges those concerns, but he encourages us to consider how fluid the tech landscape actually is. So, companies that were once considered invincible, like Yahoo and AOL, they were quickly overtaken by newer innovators.
Yeah, that's true. I barely even remember when those companies were so dominant. But isn't the concentration of power in today's tech giants different?
Well, his point is that the tech landscape is constantly evolving, The speed of innovation and the nature of digital markets, it makes it really hard for any single company to kind of maintain that dominance for too long. So he's suggesting that instead of assuming that today's giants are invincible, maybe we should focus on fostering that competitive environment that allows for new players to emerge.
Yeah, that makes sense. So instead of rushing to regulate everything, maybe we should just let the market play out and see what new innovations emerge. But can the free market really solve complex challenges like climate change?
That's where I think a nuanced understanding of environmental economics is really important. And Norberg introduces this concept that I think is really interesting. It's called the environmental Kuznets curve.
Well, it suggests that as societies get wealthier, they tend to initially pollute more, but then they reach a turning point where they can afford to prioritize environmental protection.
So is it like a trade-off then? Grow first and then clean up later? Is that really like the best we can do?
It's not about just like accepting pollution as an inevitable part of growth.
Yeah.
The idea is that wealth creation is a prerequisite for addressing a lot of these environmental challenges. Wealthy nations have the resources to invest in those cleaner technologies, to enforce those regulations, and promote sustainable practices.
So it's not really choosing between economic growth and protecting the environment. It's more about understanding that the two are actually interconnected.
Okay, but hasn't the global shift towards, things like clean energy been driven by government policies and regulations, and not just by market forces?
Well, government policies definitely play a role, but Norberg argues that innovation that's driven by market forces is equally crucial. Take, for example, fracking, a technology that has led to this surge in natural gas production in the U.S. It's significantly reduced our reliance on those coal-fired power plants.
Okay, yeah, that's a good point. So it seems like the market itself, driven by things like consumer demand and that search for, more efficient solutions, can actually drive environmental progress.
Right.
Okay, but what about carbon emissions? Even with these innovations, isn't climate change still a massive threat?
Oh, absolutely. Norberg, fully acknowledges the seriousness of climate change. He argues that putting a price on those carbon emissions is a more effective solution than the government trying to micromanage every single aspect of the economy. So, for instance, a carbon tax would create a powerful incentive for businesses to reduce those emissions and to invest in those cleaner technologies.
So instead of trying to predict which technologies are going to be successful or which industries to favor, we should just let the market sort of figure it out by creating those incentives.
Yeah,
But wouldn't a carbon tax just lead to higher prices for consumers, though?
that's a common concern. But a well-designed carbon tax can be revenue neutral, meaning the government can use the revenue that's generated to offset other taxes or even provide rebates to households. So the key is to make sure it's a predictable and transparent system that incentivizes those businesses to innovate while protecting consumers from those, undue burdens.
Gotcha. So it's about finding that right balance.
Exactly.
Okay, so we're starting to get a better understanding of, how a market-based approach can address those environmental concerns. But even if we can solve the economic and environmental challenges, isn't there a risk that capitalism, with its emphasis on, individual achievement and material wealth, will just leave us spiritually empty?
Well, Norberg tackles this question head on. He challenges that common perception that capitalism just breeds loneliness and selfishness and a lack of meaning. And he cites research that indicates that loneliness is not actually increasing. And in fact, individualism can foster cooperation with strangers.
Wait, hold on. How can individualism lead to more cooperation? That seems a little bit counterintuitive.
Think about it this way. When you don't have to rely solely on your immediate tribe or your community for support, you're more likely to engage with a wider circle of people, which can foster empathy and cooperation beyond your immediate social group.
I see what you mean. So you're branching out more. But isn't there a risk that this focus on individual achievement comes at the expense of community and those shared values?
Actually, Norberg argues the opposite. He points out that, critics of capitalism often call for more collectivism, but they rarely agree on which collective should dominate. He suggests that, those who embrace free market principles are often more tolerant of different viewpoints and lifestyles than those who are trying to impose a single unifying vision on society.
So instead of leading to, this homogenous materialistic culture, capitalism, with this emphasis on individual choice and freedom, can actually foster a more diverse and tolerant society.
Right.
That's pretty interesting. But isn't there a danger that this leads to, a culture that's obsessed with material wealth and status?
It's true. Consumerism is often seen as a byproduct of capitalism. But Norberg argues that material wealth and spiritual well-being aren't necessarily mutually exclusive. The key is how we use that wealth. So it can enable individuals to pursue their passions, to contribute to their communities, and to, find meaning in their work.
Okay, so it's not about demonizing material wealth. It's about using it wisely to create a society that values both prosperity and well-being. Are there any, real-world examples of this kind of balanced approach?
Absolutely. I mean, look at the Nordic countries. They're often cited as models of social democracy. They've achieved high levels of economic freedom and prosperity, while also, maintaining those strong social safety nets and prioritizing environmental sustainability.
So it's not really about choosing between, capitalism and socialism. It's about finding a way to harness the strengths of both systems to create a more just and equitable society.
That's a key takeaway from Norberg's analysis. He challenges us to move beyond these ideological binaries and to embrace those pragmatic solutions that actually address, those real-world challenges that we
Yeah,
face.
those binaries are always so tempting.
Yeah.
It's much easier to just, choose a side.
Yeah.
But are these solutions realistic? Given, the current political climate, there seems to be so much polarization and resistance to change.
Norberg acknowledges those challenges, but he remains optimistic. He argues that the solutions to our most pressing problems are more likely to come from within the system, through innovation adaptation, a willingness to challenge those outdated assumptions, than from like top-down, heavy-handed government control.
So instead of trying to impose a grand vision, maybe we should focus on creating the conditions for individual initiative and creativity to flourish.
Exactly.
But how do we do that in a world that feels increasingly complex and interconnected?
Norberg argues that the key is to embrace those principles that have driven progress throughout history. So individual liberty, property rights, free trade, and a recognition that, the pursuit of self-interest within a framework of rules and ethical considerations can lead to a collective benefit.
So it sounds like he's calling for kind of a renewed faith in the power of human ingenuity and cooperation to overcome these challenges that we face.
Yeah.
But what about those who are feeling left behind by things like globalization and technological change? How do we address their concerns and make sure that everyone benefits from this progress?
That's a really crucial question, and one that Norberg dedicates a significant portion of his book to exploring. He argues that a robust social safety net is essential to protect those who are struggling, but it has to be designed in a way that encourages work and self-reliance, rather than creating dependency.
So it's about finding that balance again between providing support and promoting individual agency.
Right.
Okay. But how do we make sure that those who are benefiting the most from the system contribute their fair share? There's so much talk about wealth inequality and the need for higher taxes on the rich.
Yeah, Norberg acknowledges those concerns about inequality, but he cautions against punitive measures that could stifle investment and innovation. He suggests exploring alternative approaches like a negative income tax or a universal basic income, which would provide a guaranteed minimum income to everyone, regardless of their employment status.
Wow, that's a pretty radical idea.
Yeah.
But wouldn't that discourage people from working and lead to economic stagnation?
It's definitely a controversial proposal, and there are valid concerns about its potential impact on those work incentives. But Norberg argues that it's worth considering as a way to, provide that safety net for those who are struggling to adapt to a rapidly changing economy, while also freeing up individuals to pursue their passions and to contribute to society in new and creative ways.
Yeah, it's definitely a conversation that's worth having. But how do we even begin to implement such sweeping changes in a political system that feels increasingly gridlocked and resistant to those bold ideas?
Norberg acknowledges that political reform is essential for creating a more just and sustainable society. And he argues that we need to reduce the influence of those special interests, to promote transparency and accountability in government, and to empower individuals to hold their leaders accountable.
So it's not just about changing economic policies, it's about transforming our political systems
Yeah.
to make sure that they serve the interests of everyone and not just a select few.
Exactly. And that's a central theme throughout his book. He reminds us that, the pursuit of a more just and prosperous society is an ongoing process. It requires constant vigilance adaptation and a willingness to challenge the status quo.
Just briefly, we want to say thank you for listening to Rambling Dan Rowe's Deep Dive Book Reviews. Please remember to like and subscribe to support our channel. Thank you. It is inspiring to think that, we have the power to shape the future of capitalism and to create a world where everyone has the opportunity to thrive. But it's also pretty daunting to think about, the scale of the challenge.
Yeah, Norberg doesn't shy away from the complexity. He challenges us to move beyond those simplistic narratives and embrace human progress's messy, often contradictory nature. And he leaves us with this really provocative question: what innovations and solutions might already be out there just waiting to be discovered and unleashed?
That is a great question to ponder. And it seems like, this conversation could go on for hours. There's just so much to consider and explore.
Oh, for sure.
We've covered a lot of ground today, but I feel like we've just scratched the surface. If you'd like to look deeper into the topics we've discussed, we encourage you to pick up a copy of A Capitalist Manifesto by Johan Norberg. Again, we thank you for joining us on another deep dive book review and hope you'll join us again soon. Until then, keep thinking, keep exploring, and keep asking the difficult questions.